First, it's Paul Stenner. As Charlotte said, Paul is a professor of social psychology at Open University, UK. He's one of the leading figures in the strand of critical psychology that turned the UK into the place to go for anyone who would follow the development of continental theoretical traditions in psychology. He has developed theories of liminality and affectivity, which have been very important to my own work on motives, including in my own book here, as well as to that of many others. Paul has served as the chairperson of the International Society of Theoretical Psychology, and his range of inspirations and his outlook are enormous. The pleasures of learning from Paul are many, but among them is certainly the realization that with such a wide academic horizon, it matters less whether one was brought up with Frigga Haug or Stanton Rogers, Karl Marx or Alfred North Whitehead. Paul has already contributed a lot, including as visitor to our research program on rearticulating motivation, and I can't wait to hear how he proposes to continue our common journey. So welcome to Paul.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me today, and thank you for writing this book, Morten, which you know I'll do my best to say something sensible about, but please bear in mind that I didn't receive it very long ago. And as Charlotte said in her introduction, Morten is a thinker with a lot of diverse influences in his portfolio, very broadly read, interested in issues that cross many disciplines, and also with a strong practice-oriented basis. So anything that Morten writes is in need of some digestion. and at the moment, I confess that my head is still spinning with just having finished the book. But the problem is not having something to say about it. The problem is how to select amongst the many things that it excites in me, and I'm sure in other readers, to think about. So I wanted to start by saying that, well, first of all, to continue this digestion metaphor, Morten has bitten off a big topic, motivation. There probably isn't a more substantial and important topic in the history of psychology. In fact, I'm a social psychologist by training, and usually the first ever social psychology experiment is considered to be an experiment written by somebody called, devised by somebody called Norman Triplett in the United States in about 1895, I think. And Triplett was clearly interested in motivation. So he was observing from statistics on bicycle races that people cycle that little bit faster if they're in competition. And if they're in competition and they have somebody who's pacing them, they go even faster. So he was very intrigued by this problem of how is it that even though we think we're doing the very best we can do, there are deeper resources we can draw upon, deeper energies we can draw upon, if only we put ourselves in these competitive situations. So he devised this experiment where children could reel in these lines with flags at the end, and they could do it in an apparatus that was either just them reeling or them with a friend reeling next to them, and then he could have a series of different trials and see what difference it makes having somebody next to you when you're reeling, or reeling on your own. And he called this dynamogenic effect. Is there a dynamogenic effect? Is there energy that can be sort of grabbed hold of by exploiting this competitive situation? And usually the way that this study is reported in social psychology is to say, yes, it proved that people do a lot better when they're in competition. You know, if you look at the data, it's a slightly more questionable. He had 40 kids doing this, and half of them went a bit faster when in competition. 10 of them went slower. They were a bit messed up by the fact that they were competing next to somebody, and it made no difference for 10 of them. And I was talking about this with Hannah last night, and she said, well, also there's what happens if you're the one who's losing the competition. Do you slow down or do you speed up? There's all kinds of variables, and in fact, the history of a lot of social psychology after that point was revisiting that study. So, you know, it became the source of an entire sort of tradition of motivational psychology that focused on concepts like energy via concepts like arousal. So is the fact that you've got somebody there competing with you arousing you? And will that arousal be something that will excite you to greater things, or will it be something that will turn you into sort of somebody who's a bit scared and who's anxious, and so whose performance depletes? And so you get arousal as this kind of central concept which is supposedly explaining motivation, but you get a kind of cognitive frame that can make that arousal a good thing or a bad thing, and so on and so forth. And so that there's multiple variations of this. But as Morton said earlier, that psychology sort of operates somewhere between the muscle and the moral, you know, and this is a kind of psychology that is looking to the muscular side of things. It's looking for sort of energy in a physical, biological sense that is the driver of motivation. And this concept of drive started taking off in behavioral psychology with people like Clark Hull, for example, who posited a kind of, I mean, you've got to put this in the context of post-industrial revolution, where the world had been transformed by an internal combustion engine. So all of a sudden, we don't have to get our energy simply by diverting the wind's energy by making a sail, or rowing our oars against the pressure of the sea, or having horses pull us. You know, all of these forms of energy that are transmitted, but that are essentially reinventing or redirecting natural energy. All of a sudden, you've got this coal furnace powering a train, and because this imagery of a motor transformed how people were thinking about psychological questions. And so the idea was that people have like an inner force within them, a drive within them, and that drive is to do with some energy, something like arousal, and so on and so forth. And psychology is born in this, if you like, amongst these concepts in some way. And of course, the concept of motivation itself arose with the development of psychology. We didn't talk about emotions and motivations, but in psychology the two go together, because there's the same motor in emotion and the same motor in motivation. It's in a sense, it's a positing of an internal combustion engine. Before that, of course, people would talk about the morale of an army, but before the invention of psychology, that would be morale. That would be, how do you build people up so that they're prepared to go and put themselves in a situation where they might die? You know, what can you tell them? How can you make them operate together such that they'll still do what you want them to do in, if you like, life-threatening circumstances? So motivation is a big topic. And meanwhile, of course, socially, it's become ever more important. You know, now, or since at least the second half of the 20th century, but before then, our motivation is supposed to come from within us. And a lot of that discourse of internal motivation was invented within psychology. And so the idea is we're supposed to do what we want, and we're also supposed to want what we do. So in other words, we're not supposed to be in the modern West in particular, simply obeying orders anymore. That mode of motivation from the outside is considered sort of problematic. We're supposed to be exploiting our own internal motivation. We're supposed to be working out what our own internal psychology is so that we can unleash those motivational forces. And yet, as if you like, the concept of motivation has become ever more important socioculturally, and as psychology has taken over more and more socioculturally and become the you know, one of the most popular disciplines at undergraduate levels, for example. So psychology has kind of given up motivation a little bit. It's become, as Morton describes it, pragmatically oriented. We sort of gave up these drive theories of the 1950s and 60s once we sort of had a new technology to obsess us, the digital computer. All of a sudden, we don't need this hot energy. We could just plug our computer in. We just need a little bit of energy to feed this information processing device. Everything now is cool and cold, and you know, you don't need any more these accounts. And with that comes a certain sort of pragmatism in psychology. And I love the concept that Morton develops in this book. I suggest he changes it a little bit. He talks about dogmatic pragmatics. And I can't resist thinking of it as dog pragmatics or pragdogmatics or something like that. This idea that a pragmatism can become dogmatic. We like to think pragmatism is freeing, and of course it was if you put it in the hands of William James and Peirce and so on at the turn of the 19th century, who were inventing, this was the first American serious philosophy, and it was a serious philosophy, and pragmatism was something quite complicated. But that pure form of pragmatism that you get in the US is very different from the form of pragmatism that reigns now, which is, in a sense, a pragmatism that frees you from having to think too much about the bigger questions. And Morton sums it up beautifully, I think. He says where is it? Like all other dogmatisms, it promises salvation. Salvation from utopian beliefs. Now, that I think is very, very interesting. So pragmatism of a dogmatic kind promises you salvation from the need for, if you like, beliefs beyond the local, the specific, this particular technical situation that we're in nowadays. Something that would be summed up, I think, by the technology of smart. This is, if I did have a slide, I would have put on the slide this smart technology, which I think would come into the category of a kind of motivational technology in the way that Morton is talking about it. Because smart is a concept. I'm sure you all know it. It comes from Duran, Miller, and Cunningham from a 1981 paper, a sort of management theory paper. So this has a sort of scientific heritage. And the idea is we shouldn't be considering ourselves with too much of a big picture. We shouldn't be worrying ourselves with irrelevancies. Any management strategy that we develop should be smart. And smart means it should be specific. It should be measurable. It should be attainable. It should be realistic. And it should be time-bounded, timely. So you should only be thinking in terms of these very concrete, pragmatic criteria. And of course what this is you could say it's a kind of meta-motivation, a kind of meta-motivation. It's kind of telling us that I know that you're likely to go astray and you're likely to sort of linger too long on these big questions. You're likely to ask, you know, irrelevant questions that move beyond the context that should be set. But no, remind yourself always, be smart, be specific, be measurable, be attainable, be realistic, be timely. Now, Morton's book is not smart in this way. In fact, you could say almost the opposite. It's rebelling against this dogmatic pragmatism, and it's urging us to move out of the spaces that we get stuck in, to ask ourselves not just what do we want, but to reflect upon what we want, and to reflect upon how, in a sense, our motivation is tied up with when motivation becomes a problem for us. So the issue of motivation is really raised when there's an moment of lack of motivation, and that you have to reflect and turn around upon your motivation and engage in meta. I don't know whether it's meta or meta. Who's the Greeks? Wasn't it? I would intuitively say meta motivation, but let's leave that. So meta motivation is turning around upon your motivation, asking the question of what it is that you want. And I would say that in some ways you could put a version of Morton's book into the SMART acronym. You could say it's about S, sociocultural activity theory, and Morton does say that this book can be viewed as another twig on the branch of sociocultural activity theory. But I think he's kind of being modest there. If it is another twig on the branch of a sociocultural activity theory, it's also a twig that has borne a fruit that is pulling that branch down, 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 that is transforming the tree, that's turning it into something maybe less tree-like even. So there's something going on with this engagement with sociocultural activity theory that would be one whole discussion. But certainly the development of that theoretical perspective is the S in SMART. Meta-motivation and motivation is the M. Caring for motives, transforming motives. It's probably relevant that that concept, as Morton notes, comes from Abraham Maslow. And everybody knows Abraham Maslow. He's probably the third most famous psychologist ever, right? After Freud and... Yeah, perhaps, yeah. Perhaps he's the second most famous psychologist. And you know, he has a pyramid of needs, right? So motivation is seen as, in a sense, inherently meta-motivational. You get your basic needs sorted out, and then you turn around on yourself and you say, what do I need next? Oh, shelter needs. And then you turn around on yourself, what do you need next? Oh, a bit of love would come in handy. And you turn around on yourself, and finally you get to self-actualization needs. And those self-actualization needs are the needs that Maslow calls meta-motivational. So these are the ones, if you like, that even can fly in the face of the underlying needs. You know, you can go without food if you're finishing your symphony, right? So for Maslow, this idea of transcendence, of becoming something else, of actually getting beyond our existing motives, is built into the meta-motivational needs at the self-actualization phase of his pyramid. But of course, Maslow is not at all interested. It's as if he's working, well, he's working in the States. He thinks the social order is perfectly good. The perfect social order has been set up. Maybe it can be tweaked here and there to allow a bit more self-actualization, but the society isn't an issue. All we need to do is encourage people as individuals to reflect upon their motives and to self-actualize more and more. So again, what's going on there is a kind of capturing of a kind of theorization of the becoming of what human beings are through the continual rethinking of their motivations, a capture of it in a particular kind of ideological circumstance where part of our motive isn't rethinking the social groups that we're part of, rethinking the society that we're part of. It's just being as an individual, the one who can self-actualize. So M, sociocultural activity theory, meta-motivation, aesthetics. So aesthetics is interesting because you can see it creeping in lots of areas. For Morton, Rancière is a kind of important figure, and Rancière is really interesting. And it's as if there's a paradigm shift going on whereby people are recognizing quite how important aesthetics are compared to, for example, other ways of thinking about the bases of our knowledge, like science, for example, is a way of legitimating our knowledge. But aesthetics has been sort of chased out, although if you look at the history of psychology, in fact, it was as concerned with aesthetics as it was with medicine and paramedical things like Freud, or with physics and psychophysical things like with Fechner, or with education. Aesthetics was one of the big heartlands at the core of psychology. So aesthetics, or you could say addiction. So motives reach their uh-oh moment very starkly with issues around addiction. The R in SMART is rearticulation. So this is me trying to make sense of Morton's key concepts, right? Sociocultural activity theory, meta-motivation, aesthetics, rearticulation, and technology, or technology and therapy. A can be aesthetics or addiction. T can be therapy or technology. And in some ways, thinking of therapy as technology, thinking of it as a kind of techniques. but again, not a pragmatic techniques. Morton, I'm not keeping an eye on time. I'm okay, good. So why is Morton writing this book? What are Morton's motives? This was, again, I stayed with Hannah and Niels last night, and so this came up in our conversation, so I decided I would look through the book this morning and find Morton's note. And he's very clear about them. He's very explicit about his motivations for this book. He says, I'm writing this book so that we, us here who are the readers of this book, are mobilized to a project of understanding and cultivating motives. So the motive of the book is to encourage us to think about motivation and to think about our meta-motivation. So this, I think, is really what's at play in this notion of rearticulation, the idea of rearticulating motives. So the idea, I think, that is informing, animating the book, is that we need to, as psychologists of this new type of sociocultural activity theory kind, we need to go to those places in the world where people are in the business of thinking about their motivation, are having a problem with motivation. And we need to help them to rearticulate how they're thinking about motivation and meta-motivation. So this is, I think, how it's possible to make sense of the 3 empirical chapters after the 3 theoretical chapters in this book. This is Morton involving himself with groups of people who are practically interested in how you manage questions of addiction and who are grappling with the, if you like, there's some good techniques that can be used in here, but there are also problems, there are also difficulties, impasses. How do we simultaneously make sense, for example, of the fact that the 2 dominant traditions of therapy in the addiction world are almost utterly irreconcilable and contrasting. So you've got on the one hand 12 steps programs, which, if you like, operate by a strategy of obliterating the subject of desire, the one who wants, and saying, you are a problem, what you need to do is recognize a higher power. Recognize that higher power and work for that higher power, and you will have a chance of overcoming this addiction problem that is afflicting your life, and you will see that everybody who you speak to, if they're sensible, will agree with this, and it doesn't matter what that higher power is, but pragmatically you better get a hold of it and you better use it to, if you like, give up the idea that you are in control of this situation. And then you've got motivational interviewing, which takes the opposite strategy, or also another therapy like solution-focused short therapy, which does the opposite and tries to gradually build the subjectivity, the will of the person in the difficult situation with respect to addiction, to sort of gradually to make them see that they are capable of operating a little bit more effectively than they think. Just sort of turn your back on the negatives, only look at the positives, don't say no, just always say yes to what the therapist is doing, and you'll gradually, if you like, find yourself stronger and stronger as an individual in being able. So 2 completely contrasting approaches, and what Morton is able to do is to say he can kind of explain the logic of why it's likely to fragment and bifurcate into that direction. You're likely to get therapies that, if you like, turn their back on the artfulness of what they're doing as therapies. So motivational interviewing would be a good example of that. You've got to kind of, in a sense, keep hold of the scientific justification for what you're doing in therapy, and conceal the artfulness of what you're doing, conceal the performativity of it. Or you can just go floridly with the performativity in the way that 12 Steps does, and floridly sort of turn it into a kind of theology that makes very visible that what you've got to do is perform your life differently. So you know, there's some very interesting aspects to that. There's such a lot to say. What else would I like to say? How am I doing for time, Morten? Have I still got any more time? Or?
Yeah, because we saved some time at the beginning, so there's no trouble. Go ahead.
There are a bunch of other... I'm trying to make Morten smart. I'm sort of trying to contain the array of his concepts, but of course I'm not really containing them. There are more concepts than that are needed to understand the book. So let me talk about a couple of those. So prototypes, boundary objects, rear view mirror, genealogy, motifs and motives. There's a whole plethora of these concepts, but the one that I'll just say a few words about is boundary objectivity, because I think that's quite an interesting concept. And of course it's riffing on Bowker and Starr's idea of boundary objects, but for me that concept always left me a little bit cold. But boundary objectivity seems to take it in a very interesting direction. So what Morten is asking is, first of all, he's asking, how does psychology, as it arises and as it carries on through time, through history, how does it solve this paradox at the core of its existence, which is the paradox of being a science whose subject matter is subjectivity? How do you turn subjectivity into an object? There's something deeply paradoxical about that, and it's particularly paradoxical if you put it next to, you might say, well, the other sciences did it, it's psychology's turn. Well, yes, but how did the other sciences do it? How did physicists do it? How did biologists do it? They did it by excluding subjectivity from their procedures, by measuring things really accurately, by disciplining the theory. In a sense, the success of modern science was achieved by procedures for the elimination of subjectivity. So it's not enough simply to say, now it's psychology's turn. Now it's psychology's turn, it faces this deep paradox. And so what does it do is it invents new ways of legitimating itself as a science. And so boundary objectivity has got actually at least 3 or 4 different strands to it. One strand to it is that concepts are borrowed from the physical sciences, like energy, but unlike in the physical sciences and in thermodynamics, for example, you can measure quite accurately energy. You can talk about how even though you've got translations of energy between different forms, there's a coherence, a consistency, you don't lose any, apart from entropy. And again, you can measure the loss of energy from a system in terms of entropy. It can be measured. So it's a difficult concept because it's the point at which physical sciences become maximally processual, if you like, and that comes to its zenith in Einsteinian relativity and quantum mechanics, for example, where it's kind of acknowledged that, in a sense, the physical world is a kind of congealing of energy, but energy is always, everything is energy in some ways. But psychology takes energy but uses it metaphorically. So we can't measure it, we can't specify it, but it's strong enough in the natural sciences to be a plausible scientific grounding for us in psychology. So boundary objectivity, first of all, means using a proxy as your object, okay, and drawing a veil over its proxy status and carrying on anyway, right? But there's another side to boundary objectivity, which is psychology was very tightly connected in its emergence to practical tasks, to the professions, if you like. So psychology could be useful to educationalists. It could be useful to people who were organizing the workplace. It could be useful within certain strands of medicine. So there are these professional surfaces where psychology can articulate a relevance. And so, in some ways, what psychology was able to do was benefit from both forms of legitimation, both ways of objectifying it, both ways of making itself relevant. But in a sense, neither of them were quite squarely psychology's own. So the object is not quite psychology's own, and also the practical success is not quite psychology's own. It's done for these other professions. And the professions that psychology got a foothold in, if you like, and or you might say, I don't mean this negatively because I like parasites, but that psychology parasited, the professions that psychology parasited were those that were kind of new kids on the block. It couldn't quite parasite law. Law had its own way of being a profession. And we're talking about the 19th century when the professions started to professionalize, right? A profession is not just a practice, a socially useful thing that serves a useful social function. It's a practice informed by a knowledge base, by a science, if you like. So jurisprudence is the legal knowledge base that informs law. Medicine had its own knowledge base, and again, medicine needed psychology less until Freud invented a whole space for psychology with the mental illnesses, which proved and continue to prove difficult and troublesome because these are also boundary objects. So boundary objectivity is on the boundary between a pragmatic utility and a scientific utility. And it's on the boundary between a subjective reality and an objective reality. And psychology, as it's developed, Morton says, is giving up the scientific warrant. It's almost given up. It's given up drive theories of motivation. They're still there if you trouble yourself in the textbooks, but the practitioner disciplines can go ahead perfectly well with a purely pragmatic idea of the scientific basis for what they're talking about. And of course, they've become increasingly pragmatically relevant because the question of motivation has become the big question of our time. You know, haunting the backdrop of Morton's book, a concept he uses several times, the Anthropocene. So our desires have become a problem for our planet, we could say, right? So the need for meta-motivation, the need to reflect upon the way in which we seem to be consumed by runaway motivations that we can't control, that are beyond us. Now, how do we stop runaway capitalism, for example? How do we stop runaway law? How do we struggle to stop, and now that's looming large as a bigger and bigger problem. So above all, what we need now is a way of moving beyond the short-term, small-scale pragmatism of smart and articulating motives beyond the enclaves, the narrow spaces within which they've been left by pragmatism. And that, I think, is what Morton is doing in his book.